Hi, it's Dr. Parikh, and now we're talking about what is a literature review paper. A literature review paper is a style of academic paper. It's the type of paper you'll write for a lot of psych classes. It's also the type of paper that you'll see in a lot of journals. So let me show you, let me show you how to get there. From the left navigation pane, sorry, it's going to want me to log back in. Boop, boop, boop. So from the left-hand navigation, if you come down, you'll see writing resources, and then the second one down, templates and examples. Again, Blackboard might get updated slightly between when I record now and when you see this video. If it's a massive change, I'll probably update the videos. But there's a folder, templates and examples, and a link to sample papers, which brings up this page eventually. And here I have, so you'll see this first folder says additional literature review papers, no matched research proposals. So these are older papers, which means that my expectations may have changed a little bit in the last 2 years, but also it's from when I taught classes that just required a literature review. And then I have a few other folders. Again, it may get updated by the time you see it, but I have other folders where it's the same paper, but it's two different versions of the paper. So let's see, let's look at the helping families with members with schizophrenia. So this is an actual paper that someone submitted to me that got an A. All of these sample papers are former student papers. I asked their permission to post it. I took their name out to protect them, and I tried to go through and catch all the major APA errors, but there may still be some mistakes, and they're not perfect papers, but they are strong papers. So you can see it has the title page with the running head, the full title, the name I took out or redacted, and Caldwell University. You go down, all academic papers in APA style start with an abstract. This abstract is meant to be a standalone snapshot of your paper. When you do article searches, you'll see that what you look at, first you read the title, then you read the abstract. Then if those both sound interesting, you look at the article itself and start reading different parts of that. Your abstract comes first in the paper, but it's actually the thing you write last because you want to make sure that you know exactly what you want to say. Often it shifts a little bit in the process. So the abstract should be the last thing you write. The formatting is really easy to mess up, so be careful when you do it. The word abstract doesn't get bolded. There is no indent, which is rare. Almost everything is indented. But then at the bottom of the paragraph, you have keywords. And this is like if you were tagging it for searches. So it's kind of like the hashtags of the paper. The PsycInfo, the main databases that we use are pretty clunky. And so these keywords or tags is how searches happen. I'm not really picky about what your keywords are as long as you have them. But notice again, the formatting is really funky because the word keywords is italicized. The words themselves are not capitalized unless it happens to be a proper noun. Like I think my sample might include the word Haiti. And I had it first for a long time, and I noticed a lot of people were capitalizing the first word, and I realized it was because they were just glancing at my sample and seeing, oh, the first one's capitalized. No, that's only because it was Haiti. I think I might have moved that to later in the list to avoid that confusion. Now we get to the main part of the paper. We start with the title. So this should be exactly the same title as you had at the beginning of your paper. And then we have the first paragraph here is what I call the roadmap paragraph. This is a very academic kind of paragraph. So if you're looking at your articles that you find, they probably won't have this sort of first paragraph. They'll probably kind of dive right in at the next paragraph. And they won't typically have a heading that says literature review or introduction. But this is a more academic style, so if you read a thesis or dissertation, you're more likely to see these pieces. So the roadmap paragraph should be different from your abstract. You'll have 1 or 2 sentences to grab interest to help the reader understand why this topic is important or why it's relevant to them. Then, and in this case, there's a citation because there's a specific claim. So happen to have the highest therapy dropout rate of all diagnoses. So you might start with a statistic to talk about how prevalent an issue is. So if you're citing something specific, like a specific idea or number, then you want to have a citation. You might not, you might start more broadly. It's up to you. Then it's somewhere in here you want to have a clear thesis. When your peers review it, you want to ask them, what did you think my thesis statement was? If they're not sure or if they make a wrong guess, that tells you that you need to strengthen that thesis. Here I would say that family members can encourage positive change in schizophrenia by educating relatives to ultimately produce a healthy living environment for people with this disorder. That sounds like a really strong thesis. After that, there's a couple sentences that talk about some of the main themes, so the thesis is your main point, what you're trying to say about this information. You don't know what your main point is yet because you haven't read your articles. Your main point should flow from your articles. You probably have something you're interested in your topic about, but relax, let go. The best thesis statements come based on what you find in your articles. They grow naturally from the notes you take from your articles. So next, there's sort of a sentence on each of the main themes. So the ways that this case is going to be built. Remember, you're acting like a lawyer. You are laying out evidence to support conclusions, and your citations, your paraphrases from your articles, those are your evidence. So that's the roadmap paragraph. You're introducing the main topic. Now we get into the literature review section. So you have a heading, and the heading is bolded and in the center, literature review. And the next paragraph, this is one, so roadmap paragraph is a somewhat common term, and I'll try to explain which of these things are standard, which are common but not standard, and which are things that I've just kind of made up so that I can say this paragraph and you know what I'm talking about. For this class, I have made a template that outlines, a really basic paper structure. And it's one you can keep building on for longer papers, just kind of expand it and adapt it. But you can keep reusing the rubric or the templates that I give you for lots of other classes. And I've talked to several students. They know that you're doing it. They know that you are taking the template I gave you, and they are happy because it means that you're probably going to do it correctly. Now, there are some variations. Some professors like to have a lot of headings. Others don't. Make sure that if you use a heading for a longer paper, it should probably cover 3 or 4 paragraphs. If you have a heading for every paragraph, that's a problem. You need to use topic sentences instead. But to have 2 or 3 headings in your literature review, I believe makes it easier to read. And you can see what Suchman talks about with headings and ways to cue the reader of what's going on. Really, when you're writing this, a lot of these sections feel like they're repetition, and they can be if you don't vary your writing a little bit. But the thing is, you know what you're trying to say. You've read these articles, you're really familiar with this information. Your reader is not. That's one of the reasons I have you do a lot of peer review. I want you to get feedback from people who haven't already read the material, and I want you to experience what it's like to read a paper without the context. See what's helpful, see what's confusing. It's also why this week you start out by choosing some of these sample papers to read. So this paragraph under the literature review heading, this is where most articles start. And so this paragraph I call the background paragraph because you're trying to lay some common ground. You're writing this paper as if you're writing to someone who is intelligent, likes science, has probably taken some college level classes or would do well in them if they had, but is not particularly familiar with your topic. So you could imagine that you're writing for your peers. Think of one of your classmates and imagine telling this to them as you're writing. You could also think of someone in your family who fits the bill. For me, it's my grandma. My grandma is a very smart lady. She loves reading about science. She doesn't read a lot about psychology in particular. She likes hard sciences a little more, but she didn't go to college, but she reads a lot. She's very self-educated. And so when I'm really stuck, I just open a new document, get a nice blank page, and write as if I'm trying to explain it to my grandma. So think of someone in your life who's like my grandma, or you can pick my grandma. My grandma's awesome. You can write to my grandma. She'll love it. And think about how to write. You're not trying to be super formal. You're not trying to sound exactly like the articles because you don't have those skills yet. But you do want to sound like the most academic version of yourself. You're trying to take on an academic role, just like you're a different person in different situations. So when you're with your parents, you're the child to some extent. When you're with your siblings, you are the sibling. And when you're with your friends, you're your friend. You're a friend. I'm a very different person as an aunt or a mom than I am as a friend or a professor. And with your writing, you want to adapt to the situation too. Texting with your mom or your friend should sound different from emailing with your professor, and that should sound different from writing a paper for a class. So you're learning a new style of writing, and I try to give you feedback several times along the way about how to be more and more academic sounding. And especially when we have our in-person meeting or I do a screencast just for you, I'll talk about how you're doing, what level your writing's at. So your background paragraph is where you're introducing this topic. You've got this sort of scientific sound to your voice, your writing voice, and you are really starting with what do I need to know as a baseline to understand the main points you really want to make. So here the person is briefly describing schizophrenia, and you need to have citations for this, even if it's information you already know. Remember, the only thing that's admissible in the court of an academic paper is things you have a citation for. So you can check to see if one of your articles has this kind of information. Your research articles may not because they're very to the point, which is why you have a fourth article that you'll add in near the end that can be more broad. You do not use textbooks for this because textbooks are considered secondary sources. They are summarizing what other people have already said. I want you to use primary sources, but you can use books. So books that were just written about a topic, not written to be a textbook, or you can use other articles. And you can take more than 4 articles. It may be easier to just go somewhere and find a nice broad article that you can use for these kinds of citations. You also may want to use statistics. A lot of statistics, you can find statistics in some of your articles. You may also want to find statistics from like a government website. So if it ends in .gov, I'm almost always going to approve it. If you find something from somebody's blog, I'm probably not going to approve it. And because you still need to have scholarly resources. So Wikipedia, no, a little piece of my soul dies if you try to submit something from Wikipedia. Even Wikipedia cites its sources. If you find something you like in Wikipedia, look at the source and maybe you can cite that. And if there's not a source cited, that's a red flag. So if you want to use a website, a .gov is almost always going to be good. And the government collects a lot of data on things like the rates of different disorders, suicide rates, things like that. If it's something like the National Alliance for Mental Illness, check in with me. Sometimes they're citing from something that's a better, more scholarly source. So even though they're, passing on the statistic, they might have a place you can cite that's going to be more scholarly. So if you want to use a website, if anything other than a .gov website, I encourage you to run it by me before you use it. Even things from like APA, American Psychological Association, I may say it's not scholarly enough. And there's a lot of discretion and a lot of subtle knowledge that goes into knowing what kinds of websites are scholarly and not, which is why I recommend if you want to use it, just email me and I'll help walk you through the decision. So you'll give us some foundational knowledge, some very basic information related to your topic, and you can read different sample papers to see how different people have done that. And then she also introduces the idea of family psychoeducational programs. So kind of what are they in a basic sense? So it's sort of basic, almost introducing the terminology or the main topic, and it should be like a funnel. You should start really broad. So here she starts with schizophrenia. That's pretty broad. And then goes down narrow and narrow to the specific topic. So starts with what is schizophrenia, and then gets down to a more specific what are family psychoeducational programs, and then specifically looking at these family psychoeducational programs in the context of schizophrenia. So this is a really nice funnel for the paragraph that gets us ready to step off and focus on the main topic at hand. So the real main course of your literature review paper comes in the next section. So we've got 2 themes with 2 paragraphs each. That's what I have you do for this paper. More and less all kind of seems to make it go a little wonky. So you've got, sorry, I scrolled too fast. So you've got the United at Home approach as the second theme, and there's 2 paragraphs, and you've got the education. So it walks through, each paragraph has a topic sentence that summarizes the main idea for that paragraph. And those are, so as you write, after you've drafted it once, always check to make sure you have a strong topic sentence that is the main idea. Mine often start out at the end of the paragraph. It's my little ta-da, this is what I did. But as a reader, it's really hard to follow that. Instead, you want that to be at the beginning. So here, one thing you'll notice is that each paragraph has citations from several sources. She did a really nice job here. I require at least 2 sources in each paragraph. And I require for each theme that you have at least 3 sources. I require that because when I don't require it, what I find is that students, even my best students, do 1 article per paragraph. And they're telling me the story of a paragraph, or they're telling me the story of the article. That's not what I want. What I want here is for you to integrate ideas from different articles to make a bigger point. And I find that students don't do that until I force them, because it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard skill to learn. So requiring you, it feels like a lot of bean counting, but I require it because it's the best way I've found to force you into the skills you need to learn. And if you feel stuck, you've got lots of resources. You have your peers to help you. You have the Writing Center, which is available a lot more than I am. And you also have me. For small questions, email can be great, especially if it's can you look at this paragraph and see if I pulled it off? And for bigger questions, you can set up a video conference or an in-person meeting. So we've got, the main part of this literature review is where you're discussing main ideas from the literature to make a bigger overall point. Then we get to the discussion. Now, most of the articles you read, this section where they're reviewing the literature, that is the first, page or 2, maybe 3 or 4 pages. They have lots and lots of citations. It takes a while to learn how to kind of gloss over those citations as you're reading, because they can be distracting at first. But after a while, they just disappear. And then research articles jump into other sections that we'll talk about when we talk about the research proposal. For here, you jump right into the discussion. So talking about past literature, that was the whole point of the paper. There's no study attached to it. So in the discussion section, your first paragraph of the discussion is always kind of a recap of the main purpose of the paper and a basic evaluation of whether what happened from it. Now with the literature review, that's a little repetitive feeling because you just told us the main point. You just made those points. There's no study in the middle to get confused with. Especially a paper this short, it feels very repetitive. Make sure you're varying your language a little bit, but key terms you want to keep the same so that the reader doesn't get confused. So you have a sentence or 2 that reminds the reader of the main point of the paper, the main thesis. So go back and find your thesis and think about how to state it slightly differently. And then review the main points from the paper. You'll probably want 1 or 2 citations at least when you're being specific, but you might be making more broad statements. And we'll talk in the research proposal about how that paragraph looks different. I call this the discussion summary paragraph. So if you hear me say discussion summary paragraph, that's what I mean. Almost every paper has it. And I'll tell you when I talk about how to read a research article, I'll say, this is my secret spot to look for, to understand a paper. Because even the intro and conclusion can be a little confusing. The discussion first paragraph is almost always pretty plain English and a really nice summary of what the main point and outcome of the paper. Next, you're going to talk about limitations. No study is perfect, and by definition, it's not perfect, because if you're out in the real world, there's a lot of variables that aren't controlled. If you're in the lab, you have really good control, but it's so artificial that it may not translate to the real world. So at a very basic sense, you cannot possibly have a perfect study because you can't have perfect control and perfect real world applications, generalizability. So by definition, you cannot have a perfect study. Students sometimes feel inadequate to critique, or they feel guilty, like they're being mean. This is science. This is just what we do. It's not about tearing somebody apart. It's about recognizing the limits of the study, because we want to recognize, for example, studies done with mice in a lab may or may not show the same kind of effects in humans. For example, that doesn't mean that the study was bad. It just means that you can't take it and say, okay, this is true for everybody everywhere. There's a lot of ways to critique a study. The easiest way at this level is to focus on the populations. Who is included and who wasn't. Often studies focus on college students, which is just one part of the population. They often are in the US. And what I find interesting, students will often critique when, if all three studies are in other countries, but almost no one notices that when all three studies are in the US, because we don't see it. It just feels normal to us. You don't see, just like I don't notice my glasses frames anymore because they're just part of my field of vision, we don't notice our own biases. We don't notice things that look like us. For this, I want to see a limitation from at least one from each study with citations. And you can talk about race, age, religion, any sort of issues with your population. Next up, you will talk, actually I've changed the format for this a little bit to make it easier, because I used to have you jump around, but now this is going to be limitations and future research. So you're going to take at least two of these limitations you talk about, and you don't need a separate heading. You'll have a second paragraph where you talk about what people should do in the future to build on and improve these. So you're separating it out into two different paragraphs, but you're talking about the same thing. So then the last paragraph before the conclusions will be your professional applications. This is where you talk about how you take what's going on in this study, what the main findings were, and how people use them in their actual jobs. People like counselors, teachers, nurses, social workers. You might even have things like school administrators or lawmakers or pediatricians, law enforcement, all sorts, whoever logically will be working with your population. You never talk about clients here or individuals because they're not reading this. This isn't a magazine or a blog article. It's an academic article for other professionals to read. So if you want to say, for example, parents should hug their kids more. You wouldn't say parents can apply this by hugging their kids more, because parents aren't reading this. But you might say something like, pediatricians can encourage parents at wellness visits to hug their children more. So think about who's going to have the contact with those people and can pass those messages on. You'll go down and have a conclusion paragraph where you, again, remind the reader of the main idea, the main points, and wrap things up. You'll go on and you'll have a references page that's formatted in APA style. I don't have particular page requirements for this class because it's writing intensive. You do have to write at least 15 pages altogether. That has not been a problem for anybody so far. Other classes may have specific requirements, but for now, I'm more focused on the content. Are you getting everything in that you need to? And when that happens, usually it's somewhere in the range of 7 to 8 pages, sometimes a page or two more, sometimes a page or two less. But I don't want you to get, when there's a page minimum, what I find is that students write a lot of fluff, and then at the end, no matter how many times I've said, you don't need fluff, you're going to run out of room, I have students run out of room and mad at me that I enforce page maximums, which I do because in the real world, when journals are looking at articles, they often have maximum page numbers. And if you're over that, they won't consider you because they only have so many pages to print. So that is the basic overview of a literature review. The purpose of it is to talk about previous articles, what's been found, and I went in detail quite a bit through each section. For the research proposal, I might skip over a few more because that happens a little later in the semester. Thanks. Bye.